Welcome to the shores of our new lesson today, guys. We are now in lesson or section 3 of the Gilded Age. This lesson is called Immigration. So go to a new page in your notes if that is the format we are using, because I'm recording this in the summer when we have no clue what is going on. And go ahead and write your title up at the top of your Cornell notes. Don't forget to write the EQ. How were new immigrants seen and treated when they came to America during this time? This is the late 1800s, very early 1900s. This is the Gilded Age, the age of industry, factories, people moving from the country or rural places to the cities, the urban places. And of course, many, many people moving from other places in the world to the United States to call it their new home. And the reason they came here was for those factory jobs. So we're talking about this topic of immigration in this lesson today. And you'll notice as you write down your title, the background picture here is immigrants on a ship going through New York Harbor. And they see the Statue of Liberty. Because during this time period, most of the immigrants that were coming to the United States that we're talking about were actually coming from Europe. From new places in Europe than had previously been the case, like Northern and Western Europe, where the old immigrants had come from for the past hundreds of years. New immigrants will be coming from like Southern and Eastern Europe, and they will mostly be coming into the United States through New York City. That was the major immigration processing station there at Ellis Island, right behind the Statue of Liberty. Of course, on the statue's podium there, as she's greeting immigrants to our shores, there's inscribed the words, "Give me your poor, you're tired, you're sick, your huddled masses yearning to be free." That is the actual text on the Statue of Liberty, who was a gift from France to the American people. Let's start with a basic definition of what an immigrant is, because there's a lot of unnecessary controversy around immigrants these days under the Trump administration. Immigrants are people who come from a foreign nation to settle here permanently, to make America their home. America is a nation of immigrants. Let me repeat that. Everybody who is in America at one point in their family's history, regardless of their skin color, was an immigrant. Okay, so to say that for people to have discrimination towards immigrants and say that we shouldn't have immigrants and that immigrants are ruining this country and other things, that is extreme hypocrisy. Remember, hypocrisy, word hypocrite, when you say something is bad but then you're doing the exact opposite. Yeah, everybody goes back to immigration. The only people that could maybe claim otherwise would be Native Americans, because they were here long before the first European colonizers came over. However, even Native Americans were not originally from North and South America. They had migrated over on small boats from the Pacific and possibly also across the land bridge during the last ice age, Beringia. So all that aside, this is what we're talking about, immigrants, because there was a very large number, millions and millions of immigrants that are coming, especially in the 1890s during this Gilded Age, because of the factory jobs, the opportunities that they presented. And you can see there's lines of them there. There's them being processed as they enter the country, having their names taken down, their thumbprints taken, everything. And there's again the Statue of Liberty that stands as a beacon to immigrants. And she represents our country, kind of also representing the fact that we are a nation of immigrants. Now, old immigrants, like I said, are those that are coming from Northern and Western Europe primarily. So think like German immigrants that came from Germany and the nations that will eventually make up Germany. They settled in Pennsylvania, like the Pennsylvania Dutch, the Amish. They settled in Texas through Galveston Port. Many German immigrants came to places in Texas, such as West, the community that's right north of us on the interstate where they had that big fertilizer plant explosion in 2017. That's a Czech or German community. You also have a big German community in South Texas in Fredericksburg, where Admiral Nimitz from World War II is from. So there's German immigrants, there's English immigrants, part of this old immigrant group, but of course, English immigrants made up the backbone of the 13 colonies that will eventually form the United States of America and our early government. The reason we speak English, the reason a lot of our laws and our government looks like England is because they helped to found this country. You also have French early immigrants settling along the St. Lawrence, Canada, along the Mississippi, and Louisiana from the Acadians. So that's some of the old immigrant groups. Now, things that they shared in common, especially the English who founded this country, they were Protestant Christians. Of many different denominations, you know, Puritan, Baptist, Methodist from the Great Awakenings and whatnot, but they were Protestant Christians primarily, and most spoke English and shared common cultures and customs and traditions. Okay, so now in the late 1800s, especially 1890s, the new immigrants that are coming over are very different. They're coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. And Southern Europe, think primarily the Italians, okay? You think Italy, you think pizza, even though that's actually an American invention, but Italian food, pastas, you know, all this stuff, where the Pope is in Rome. Italy was the main place that a lot of these Southern Europeans were coming from. What language do Italians speak? They speak Italian. Okay, very different. That's not like English at all. Now in Eastern Europe, many of these immigrants coming from Eastern Europe, they're coming from places like Poland, Romania, they're coming from Bulgaria, they're coming from Russia. And especially these Romani people, the Russians that came over, they were very, very different. Many of them were not even Christian at all. Like the Italians, they're Catholic, right? That's a different sort of Christianity from Protestant. The Catholic Church has very different rituals and customs than most like Protestant churches, but it's still Christian, right? The Eastern European immigrants that came over from like Romania and Poland, many of them were Jewish, okay? And in Judaism, it's very different. Or they were speaking also different languages: Polish, Romani, Russian, Yiddish, Hebrew. Like that's like, what are they saying? The reason I bring up all these differences is that this engendered a lot of tension and conflict within America. A lot of people became very uneasy and even upset at these immigrants being over here. You know, we don't like what's different. It causes fear and anxiety. So the difference in language freaked people out, the difference in foods, how they comported themselves, how they acted. But then also the biggest point of conflict between these old and new immigrant groups was the competition over jobs, okay? And you could see some images of this. We'll look at this political cartoon in just a second, kind of being derogatory or rude towards Irish immigrants. In this photo, you see, excuse me, you see a Jewish immigrant family. There's the Star of David. That's the sign of the Jewish people. You can see they're wearing like the yarmulkes. That's the Jewish head covering. And you see here's a sign actually posted probably in front of a business that says "Help Wanted," but no Irish need apply. We're not hiring any Irish people. Ireland is also a big country for immigration to the United States. It's in Western Europe, but they were also included in this new immigrant group as far as being discriminated against. When you discriminate against somebody because they're an immigrant, that's called nativism. Just like if you discriminate against somebody because of race, that's called racism. You discriminate against somebody because of sex or gender, that's called sexism. So now we have a new form of discrimination to learn. Oh boy, America. Speaking of nativism or discriminating against immigrants, please, let's take a look and analyze this political cartoon. You see the American flag. What do you notice about it? It's upside down. In fact, let me see, I could do the pointer here, that'll help. Okay, so you see the American flag is upside down. You see this is a US public school and it looks like it's in ruins. You see there are children here. What's happening to them? They're being thrown off a cliff. You see right here, there's a woman, she's being dragged to the gallows. That's where they would hang people. You see there's this teacher here and he's trying to protect these kids, and look what's trying to attack them. It's these these alligator, crocodile-looking creatures. But if you look closely, that's actually a person. That's like a religious figure, like the Pope or a bishop, a Catholic church person, because that's like the popish hat there. And these Catholics, they're the ones coming up like alligators, about to attack these poor people, which we could assume are Americans based on this. You can see here's the government building, but it's actually, wait, it's not the government building. It's a Catholic church. The Catholic Church has taken over our government. See, there's a cross on the top. So, oh, and then finally, don't forget to read the title at the bottom, the American River Ganges. The Ganges River in India is noted for being a very crowded, filthy river in a very, very crowded nation. So it's talking about the filth that is washing up on America's shores. And that filth in this political cartoon is the Irish people. They're Catholic. They're coming over. And a lot of Americans feel very, you can see, very threatened by this invasion. So this is a cartoon showing nativism or discrimination towards immigrants. You don't have to write down this chart, but it would be a good idea, or maybe just listen. Comparing, contrasting the old immigrants versus the new immigrants. Old immigrants, they came from Northern and Western Europe, England, Germany, France, Spain, like the Spanish conquistadors. It's definitely old. New immigrants, they came from Southern and Eastern Europe. Southern, we're thinking Italy, Italia. We're thinking Eastern Europe, we're thinking like Poland, Romania, we're thinking Russia. The old immigrants were primarily Protestant. That's where you get denominations such as Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian, Trinitarianism, Lutheran, all those others. The new immigrants, if they came from like Italy, they were Catholic, Roman Catholic. They came from Russia, they might have been Eastern Orthodox. If they came from other places in Eastern Europe, they might have been Jewish, not Christian at all. So very different religiously. Old immigrants were literate, meaning they knew how to read and write. They had skills that were learned, how to be an editor, how to make paper, etc. A lot of these new immigrants that came over, many of them were farmers, peasants. You know, they came over because they had nothing, and oftentimes even they were fleeing because of push factors such as war, famine. So they had to get out of their old country really fast. So they did not bring over a lot of skills to jobs. They're unskilled, and of course illiterate. Not many of these new immigrants knew how to speak or much less read or write English. The old immigrants, if you were coming in the 1890s from England, you're set, right? You speak the language, you know the customs and culture. You can assimilate or learn how to fit in very quickly. That was the opposite for these new immigrants, who would find it very difficult to acculturate or to assimilate, to fit in. Oftentimes, their children would go to public schools to try to learn English, try to learn to assimilate, and there would be, you know, familial clashes between parents and children, as the children kind of lost their family's culture as they made America their homes. Old immigrants often came from countries with democracies, like England has a constitutional monarchy. They get to elect the people who lead them in parliament, even though they have a king or queen. The king or queen is seen as like a figurehead. So they're used to getting to elect their leaders and have a say. Many of the immigrants that were coming over from Southern and Eastern Europe, they were coming from very undemocratic nations that were led by dictators, or warring nations where they were fleeing for their own lives. So they were not used to democracy or getting to have a say in their government. All right, so these are the differences between the old and new immigrants. Biggest thing, make sure you know where they're coming from. Make sure you know that during this time in the Gilded Age, we have these new immigrants coming over from Southern and Eastern Europe, and they are seen as different, and they will be discriminated against because of these differences. All right, here's a nice chart table, and we're supposed to answer the question there at the bottom. In which decade did Southern and Eastern European immigrants start outnumbering Northern and Western European immigrants? So here on the table, we see the numbers coming from the old immigrants versus the new immigrants, and here's the percentages. So it looks like there's way more old immigrants than new. Let's look here. There's 2,031,000 old immigrants versus 33,000. So there's still, but this time, this decade is 1861 through 1870. So that's the 1860s. There's still more old immigrants coming over. Look at the 1870s. There's still more old immigrants. 1880s, way more old immigrants. 1890s, that's the 1890s, 1,643,000 versus 1,942,000. Okay, so that's the first decade we see where there's actually more new immigrants than old immigrants. You see how I found that? Very easy, just looking down the chart. And that decade again was the 1890s. So that would be my answer to the question. First decade where we see more new immigrants coming than old immigrants was the 1890s. Where did immigrants come into the United States at? Well, like I said, all of these new immigrants that are coming from Europe, from like Southern and Eastern Europe, they're coming over from the Atlantic Ocean, and they're coming into our nation at New York Harbor, New York City. They would see the Statue of Liberty. She was a gift completed in 1886. She was a gift from the French to the American people, kind of to symbolize the friendship between France and America. If you didn't know, during the American Revolution, when we gained our independence from Britain, France helped us to win that war. So we do have very close ties with the French. And like I said, on that statue at the podium is inscribed, "Give me your poor, you're tired, you're sick, your huddled masses yearning to be free." So they'd sail on boats right past Liberty Island, seeing that beacon of hope as they entered a new country to make their new lives. And then the boat would dock right here at Ellis Island. And there's a picture of the inside of Ellis Island back in the end of the 19th century. And this is where they would be processed. So that was where immigrants would have their names written down. They'd have to answer some questions by an immigration agent. He'd ask something like, where are you coming from? What's your name? Do you have any family here? What do you plan on doing? Give you a stamp. Make sure you're not sick. We don't want you bringing in diseases or starting, God forbid, a new global pandemic, right? And then they would get on a train after being processed, and they would enter America. So that's the main immigration processing station for most immigrants at this time on the East Coast at New York City, Ellis Island. The other immigration processing station in the Gilded Age, late 1800s, early 1900s, was on the West Coast in San Francisco Harbor at Angel Island. And if you know anything about San Francisco, that's the city with the beautiful Golden Gate Bridge. And of course, Alcatraz Island, the famous prison where the gangsters like Al Capone were held. Angel Island is right there inside of the Golden Gate Bridge in Alcatraz Island. And at Angel Island, immigrants primarily from Asia would come into the United States. They'd be processed and they'd enter the country there from the West Coast. So that was like for Chinese immigrants, Japanese, Vietnamese, etc. Eventually, like I said, Galveston port will also open up for a lot of European immigrants. But you notice we're not talking about immigration on our southern border from like Mexico to the United States, because at this time the border was pretty open. America needed a lot of Mexican immigrants to work like field labor jobs. And so there wasn't much like border control on our southern border. And that wasn't really a big topic or point of contention like it is today. We're mainly at this time talking about immigrants who were having to come over on boats to the United States. This is the late 1800s, early 1900s. All right, last thing I want to talk to you guys about is once they came over, how they lived. Many of these immigrants, they're coming over very poor. Remember, you come over either for push factors or for pull factors. A push is like something that forces you to leave a place. War, disease, famine, when nothing will grow and you starve to death. These are things that, for natural disasters, they make you have to leave the place or you're gonna die, okay? Many of these immigrants that were coming from like Eastern Europe, like we talked about, they were forced to leave those places because their families were at risk. There was war going on, they were being discriminated against because they were Jewish, etc. A pull factor, that's the other thing that mainly brings so many millions of these immigrants in during this time we're talking about the Gilded Age. Pull factors are those things that make you want to come to a place. Opportunities such as like jobs or gold, the discovery of gold that could make you rich, or silver. Those things that make you want to come, mainly jobs is what we're talking about. So most of those coming over are very, very poor. And so they're not going to be living like, you know, in high rises. They're going to be living in tenements. And the tenements is a very crowded, shabby kind of apartments for immigrants in the cities. Usually they were located in the factory districts, so they'd be close to where these immigrants would mostly be getting their jobs in factories. The tenements, apartments themselves were very, very small, and you would not only have the immigrant family, like the nuclear family, staying in these crowded, like one-room apartments. That nuclear family is the mom, the dad, the kids, but also in these little one-room apartments, you would have the extended family. You would have the aunts and uncles, their children, your cousins, maybe grandpa and grandma, if they were able to come over as well, all staying in a one-room apartment. And bathrooms, communal bathrooms. It was shared by the whole floor. So it was very, very unsanitary as well. And this was the cheap housing in the cities. They were called the tenements. So that was primarily where immigrants ended up in. And again, in the cities. Why in the cities? Because that's where jobs were, jobs in the factories. Now, many immigrants felt very uncomfortable when they first arrived. They don't speak English. They don't know how to fit in. They're having trouble to assimilate. Remember, assimilation means fitting in. So they would form ethnic ghettos. Now, we use the word ghetto kind of in a different way today, but a ghetto is like a neighborhood where everybody was kind of from the same culture. So think like in the city, like Chinatown. That's where like a lot of Chinese immigrants would all live and work together in the same area because they feel more comfortable with people who are like them. They can communicate easier. They have the foods that they like there. Best authentic Chinese food you can get in America, like in Chicago's Chinatown district. Go to a Chinese restaurant in Chinatown. You can get some real dim sum where they have it on those spinning tables. You could try a little bit of this and that. The reason it's so authentic or so like actually like Chinese food is because it was, you know, it's a restaurant that's actually founded by Chinese immigrants. Same thing for like Little Italy. That's another like example of an ethnic neighborhood. The children of immigrants, like I mentioned, they would be assimilated in public schools. They would be taught English. Oftentimes, this led to cultural clashes within the family of these immigrants because the new generation, the kids, they would be kind of forsaking or giving up their parents' culture as they learn to adapt to this new culture. We talked about this a little bit with like the Dawes Act and Native Americans from 1887. Remember, the Dawes Act forced Native Americans to assimilate. And if they did not, they were rounded up and put on reservations or worse. Well, their children, the children of Native Americans that were killed, the orphans, they were put into schools and they were forced to adopt the habits of civilized life, which meant be like the white man, learn English, cut your hair, wear Western style clothing, forget everything that made you Native American. So similar thing happening with the immigrants, but it's not being forced. This is happening due to their immigration. All right, we will stop there. Please remember that this is not the end of the lesson, so just put a pause on the notes, and I will talk to you next time in part 2 of immigration. Thank you guys very much.